The last shift nobody understood. The first sign that something was wrong wasn't the closure notice. It was the way Walter Grayson kept showing up afterward. 3 weeks had passed since the announcement. The giant Riverton manufacturing plant, an aging factory that had once produced industrial motors for half the region, was winding down its final operations. Workers who had spent 20, 30, even 40 years inside its walls were slowly clearing out lockers and carrying cardboard boxes to the parking lot. Some left angry, some left relieved, most left quietly. But every morning at 6:15, Walter still walked through Gate 3 with his lunch pail in one hand and a weathered leather notebook in the other. No one had asked him to. The company wasn't paying him overtime. There wasn't much left to repair, yet there he was. The security guards stopped asking questions after the first week. The old electrician would nod, sign the visitor log, and disappear into the cavernous building as if the factory were still alive. Outside, late November rain drummed against corrugated steel roofs. The parking lot that once held hundreds of vehicles now contained fewer than 20. Wind pushed scraps of paper across empty loading docks. The place felt strange, like a town after everyone had moved away. Inside, silence had begun settling into spaces where noise had ruled for decades. Walter noticed every difference. A factory speaks, even when people don't. For 47 years, he'd listened to it. The rhythmic clatter of conveyor chains, the groan of hydraulic presses, the deep hum of transformer rooms, the sharp metallic snap of relay switches. Most people heard noise. Walter heard language, and now that language was fading. He walked through Assembly Hall B, moving beneath rows of hanging lights. Dust floated through pale beams filtering from skylights overhead. The machines stood motionless. Some already wore bright demolition tags. Others waited for auction crews. Walter stopped beside an old winding machine and rested his hand against its steel frame. Cold. 3 weeks ago it had been warm. A strange sadness crossed his face before disappearing again. He opened his notebook and wrote something. Just a single line. Then he continued walking. Nobody noticed these rituals anymore. Nobody except Leah Moreno. Leah was 32 and had been assigned to oversee demolition preparation for the site. She wasn't from Riverton. She'd arrived 2 months earlier carrying architectural plans, engineering surveys, and deadlines. Her job was simple: catalog everything, prepare everything, remove everything. At least that's what headquarters believed. From her temporary office overlooking the factory floor, she often spotted Walter making his rounds. Always the same route, always alone, always carrying that notebook. At first she assumed he was struggling with retirement. She'd seen it before. People who spent decades in one place sometimes didn't know how to leave it. But something about Walter felt different. He wasn't wandering. He wasn't reminiscing. He was checking things, monitoring things, working, as if some invisible responsibility still belonged to him. One afternoon, Leah found him kneeling beside an electrical cabinet near the western wall. The cabinet wasn't connected to any active production equipment. Most of the surrounding systems had already been disconnected. Yet Walter was tightening a terminal connection with careful precision. Leah approached. "Mr. Grayson?" Walter glanced up. His face carried the permanent weathering of someone who had spent a lifetime around machinery and harsh winters. Deep lines framed his eyes. Not bitter lines, working lines. "Afternoon," he said. Leah looked at the cabinet. "I thought this section was already shut down." "It is." "Then why are you fixing it?" Walter returned his attention to the wiring. "Because it was loose." Leah almost laughed, not because the answer was funny, because it sounded completely serious. After a moment she said, "The building's closing." "I know. You won't need this." Walter tightened the last connection and slowly stood. For a second he seemed about to explain something. Instead he simply closed the panel. Some things don't stop mattering just because somebody writes a date on a piece of paper. Then he walked away. Leah watched him disappear between rows of silent machinery. The answer bothered her for reasons she couldn't explain. That evening she reviewed electrical shutdown maps in her office. Most systems had already been disconnected. Others were scheduled for removal over the next month. Everything seemed straightforward, until she noticed a small anomaly. One circuit remained active, a single isolated line. It branched away from the main network and disappeared into an older section of the factory. No demolition order mentioned it. No active equipment depended on it. According to records, it served no purpose, yet power consumption reports showed tiny amounts of electricity flowing through it every day. Not much, just enough to suggest something remained connected. Leah checked maintenance logs. The circuit appeared repeatedly, and next to nearly every inspection entry was the same signature, W. Grayson. She leaned back in her chair. Outside, rain struck the windows harder. The factory lights reflected against dark glass. For the first time, genuine curiosity replaced professional concern. What exactly was Walter keeping alive? The following week brought colder weather. Demolition crews arrived to begin preliminary surveys. Engineers marked walls with fluorescent paint. Forklifts moved equipment toward loading bays. The building seemed to understand its fate. Each day felt smaller than the one before. Yet Walter continued his routine. Every morning, every afternoon, every evening, checking panels, inspecting conduits, walking corridors that most employees no longer entered. People joked about it occasionally. Nobody meant harm. He's probably trying to adopt the building. Maybe he forgot he retired. Maybe they should put him in the auction. Walter never responded. Sometimes he smiled politely, sometimes he didn't seem to hear them at all. One rainy evening, after most workers had left, Leah happened to glance through her office window. She spotted Walter crossing the far end of the factory, not toward the exit, toward an older maintenance corridor, a section of the building rarely used anymore. Something about the timing felt deliberate. Leah checked the clock. 6:48 p.m. Almost everyone else was gone. Curiosity got the better of her. She grabbed her coat and followed. The corridor was dimly lit. Water rattled against distant roof panels. The deeper she went, the older the building felt. Paint peeled from concrete walls. Pipe insulation showed its age. Old warning signs hung crooked beneath flickering lights. Ahead, Walter moved steadily through the shadows. He didn't seem lost. He knew exactly where he was going. The corridor eventually ended at a heavy steel door. Leah slowed. The door wasn't marked on most modern building plans. Walter reached into his pocket. A key appeared. Not a modern security card, an actual key, old brass, worn smooth by decades of use. He unlocked the door, pulled it open, then stepped inside. Before the door could close completely, Leah caught a glimpse through the opening. A burst of warm light spilled into the corridor. Not fluorescent light, something older, softer. Rows of industrial lamps flickered awake inside the hidden space. Walter disappeared beyond them. The door closed. Leah stood motionless. Rain echoed faintly through the building. Her heart beat a little faster than it should have, because for the first time since arriving in Riverton, she wasn't looking at a demolition project. She was looking at a secret. And somewhere behind that steel door, the old electrician everyone thought couldn't let go was protecting something no one else even knew existed. The machines beneath the dust. Leah barely slept that night. The image of the hidden room lingered in her mind long after she returned home. She kept replaying the moment the steel door opened, the unexpected glow of old lamps, the glimpse of machinery that shouldn't have existed according to any blueprint she had seen. By morning, curiosity had become determination. When she arrived at the factory, a hard frost covered the empty parking lot. Thin sheets of ice glittered on puddles left by the previous day's rain. The sky hung low and gray over Riverton, making the massive factory appear even older than it already was. Walter was already inside. Of course he was. Leah found him near the Eastern Transformer room, making notes in his familiar leather notebook. "Morning," she said. Walter nodded. "Morning." Neither spoke for a moment. The hum of electrical equipment filled the silence. Finally, Leah decided to be direct. "I followed you yesterday." Walter's pencil stopped moving. Not dramatically, just enough. "I figured you might. You didn't seem surprised. I've worked around people my whole life. Curiosity has a sound." Leah almost smiled. "I want to know what's behind that door." Walter closed the notebook. His expression didn't harden. If anything, it grew tired. "That room isn't part of your demolition project." "Everything in this building is part of my demolition project." A faint trace of amusement crossed his face. "That's what worries me." Before Leah could press further, Walter walked away. Not angry, not dismissive, just finished with the conversation, which somehow made the mystery worse, because people hiding something usually defended it. Walter simply carried the weight of it. 3 days later, Leah finally gained access, officially. While reviewing old facility archives, she discovered that the hidden section had never been properly documented during multiple ownership changes. The room technically belonged to the company. That meant she had authority to inspect it. A facilities supervisor located an old duplicate key. By late afternoon, Leah stood once again in the dim maintenance corridor. This time she wasn't sneaking. The steel lock clicked open. The heavy door groaned inward, and the room revealed itself. For a moment, she simply stared. It wasn't storage, it wasn't abandoned, it wasn't forgotten. It had been preserved. The space stretched far larger than expected, occupying an entire hidden wing beneath the oldest section of the factory. Massive switchboards lined the walls, copper bus bars gleamed beneath protective covers. Analog gauges, relay banks, transformers, and control panels filled the room. Many looked old enough to belong in a museum. Yet everything was immaculate. Dust existed, but only where dust naturally settled. Nothing was neglected. Nothing was broken. Someone had spent years maintaining it. Someone named Walter Grayson. The overhead lamps cast a warm amber glow across polished metal surfaces. The room felt strangely alive, as if the factory's original heart had been hidden away while the rest of the building modernized around it. Leah walked slowly between the equipment. Every panel carried handwritten labels. Every circuit diagram had been carefully updated. Every maintenance record appeared organized. Then she noticed something unexpected. Photographs. Several black and white photographs sat inside simple frames on a workbench. Factory workers, electrical crews, men standing beside machinery during earlier decades. One photograph caught her attention. A younger version of Walter stood beside another man. The resemblance was unmistakable. Same eyes, same posture, same quiet expression. His father. Leah knew it immediately. She picked up the frame. The back carried a handwritten date, 1974. Beneath it were 3 words, Control Room Crew. A voice behind her broke the silence. That's him. Walter stood in the doorway. Leah lowered the photograph carefully. Your father? Walter nodded. For several seconds, neither spoke. Then Walter walked into the room. His footsteps echoed softly across concrete floors. He helped build most of this system. Leah looked around. Why hide it? Walter ran a hand across an old control panel. The room wasn't hidden originally. What happened? He hesitated. The pause seemed heavier than the answer itself. There was an accident. The words settled heavily in the air. Leah waited. Eventually, Walter continued. Summer of 1978. His eyes remained fixed on the machinery. There was a power failure during peak production. Something went wrong. You were here? I was 23. His voice softened. My father didn't come home. The room suddenly felt colder. Leah glanced again at the photograph. The smiling man frozen inside the frame. A life interrupted decades earlier. I'm sorry. Walter nodded once. Most people stopped talking about it after a few years. But you didn't. No. The answer came immediately. No hesitation. No uncertainty. Just truth. That evening, after Walter left, Leah remained inside the control room. Questions kept multiplying. Something didn't fit. The official company records described the accident as a routine electrical failure. Brief, unfortunate, resolved. Yet nothing about Walter's behavior suggested a routine tragedy. People grieved, people healed, people moved forward. Walter had spent nearly 50 years protecting this room. Why? The answer had to be bigger than memory. She began searching old archives, maintenance reports, safety audits, engineering records, newspaper clippings. Hours passed. Outside, darkness settled across Riverton. Then she found it. Or rather, she found what was missing. A sequence of inspection reports from the months surrounding the accident had vanished. Not misplaced. Removed. The numbering jumped. Entire sections simply disappeared. Leah frowned. The omission was too deliberate. She continued digging. Near midnight, buried inside a damaged storage box, she discovered a stack of aging documents. One wasn't. A handwritten incident summary. Incomplete, unsigned, never officially filed. The paper described emergency power rerouting procedures performed during the night of the accident. Procedures that never appeared in the company's final version. Leah read the page twice, then a third time. Her pulse quickened. The official story wasn't the whole story, not even close. The next morning she confronted Walter. Not aggressively, carefully. They sat inside the hidden control room while snow flurries drifted outside narrow basement windows. Leah placed the document on the workbench. Walter stared at it. His expression changed instantly. Not surprise, recognition. He knew exactly what it was. You found one. One what? A piece. The words barely rose above a whisper. Leah leaned forward. Walter, what really happened here? For a long moment, he didn't answer. The transformers hummed softly in the background. Finally, he spoke. I've spent most of my life trying to figure that out myself. Leah looked at him, and for the first time, the stubborn old electrician didn't seem stubborn at all. He seemed tired. A man carrying decades of unanswered questions. A son who had never fully buried his father. The room wasn't a museum. It wasn't an obsession. It was a promise. A promise Walter had never stopped keeping. Outside, the winter sky darkened earlier than usual. Far away, thunder rolled unexpectedly across the horizon. A storm was moving toward Riverton. Walter glanced toward the distant sound. For the first time since Leah had known him, concern crossed his face. Not for himself, not for the building, for something else. Something hidden within the aging electrical system surrounding them. He slowly stood. We may have a problem. What kind of problem? Walter listened, just listened, as though the factory itself were speaking. Then his eyes narrowed. The kind that shouldn't be happening. Another rumble echoed through the building, this time closer. And somewhere deep within the factory's forgotten infrastructure, something answered, with a faint, unsettling crackle. The circuit he never abandoned. The storm arrived just after sunset. By 8 o'clock, rain hammered the factory roof so hard it sounded like gravel being thrown from the sky. Wind pushed against the aging walls, rattling loose metal panels and whistling through vents that had not been used in years. Most of the demolition crews had already gone home. Only a handful of security staff remained. Leah stood beside Walter in the hidden control room as another roll of thunder shook the building. The old electrician wasn't watching the storm. He was watching the gauges. Every few seconds, his eyes moved from one instrument to another, listening, measuring, waiting. The concern Leah had seen earlier hadn't disappeared. It had grown. Then one of the needles twitched. Walter immediately noticed. That's not right. What is it? The backup feeder. Leah stared at the panel. To her, it looked like a collection of outdated gauges and switches. To Walter, it was a language, and he had just heard something alarming. A bright flash of lightning exploded outside. Half a second later, thunder crashed directly overhead. The factory lights flickered. Once, twice. Then darkness swallowed everything. The hum of the building vanished. For the first time in nearly a century, Riverton Manufacturing sat completely silent. The silence lasted only a few seconds. Then emergency lights blinked on. A dim red glow spread through the room. Walter was already moving. Come on. Leah followed him into the corridor. What happened? The main supply failed. Because of the storm? Partly. His pace quickened. But something else is happening. Rainwater dripped from overhead pipes as they hurried through the aging maintenance tunnels. The factory felt different in the darkness. Bigger, older, unpredictable. Ahead, security radios crackled with confused voices. Nobody seemed to know exactly what had failed. Walter did, or at least he had a theory. The deeper they moved into the building, the more focused he became. Years seemed to fall away from him. The 71-year-old man suddenly carried himself like the electrician he once was. Not because he moved faster, because he moved with certainty. At an intersection of service corridors, he stopped abruptly. A faint smell hung in the air. Burning insulation. Walter closed his eyes, just for a moment. Then he pointed. That way. Leah followed. The smell grew stronger. Behind a locked access panel, they discovered the source. An aging relay assembly, one of the original emergency systems. A system nobody had included in modern diagrams. Nobody except Walter. The relay sparked violently. A shower of blue arcs jumped between contacts. Walter immediately shut down the circuit. The sparks disappeared, but his expression remained tense. This shouldn't have activated. What does it do? 48 years ago, it helped prevent a disaster. Leah looked at him. The realization hit her. The night your father died. Walter nodded. For a moment, neither spoke. Rain pounded against distant walls. Water dripped steadily somewhere in the darkness. Finally, Walter opened the relay cabinet. Inside sat a small metal box, hidden, deliberately placed. His hands froze. He knew exactly what he was looking at. Slowly, carefully, he removed it. Dust covered the surface. The latch resisted before finally opening. Inside were documents. Old documents. Protected from time. Protected from demolition. Protected from being forgotten. Walter stared at them as though he had spent half a lifetime searching for their existence. Maybe he had. Leah watched him unfold the first page. His hands trembled, not from age, from anticipation. The document carried maintenance signatures, emergency response logs, and engineering reports dating back to the night of the accident. Reports that had never appeared in company archives. Walter read silently, page after page. The storm seemed to disappear around them. Then he stopped. A long breath escaped him. Leah could see emotion gathering behind eyes that had spent decades refusing to show it. "What is it?" Walter looked down at the paper. "My father didn't cause the accident." The words came quietly, almost carefully, as if speaking them too loudly might make them disappear. Leah stepped closer. Walter handed her the report. She read, and suddenly the missing pieces fit together. The factory had suffered a catastrophic electrical failure that night, a failure capable of triggering explosions throughout several production areas. Hundreds of workers had still been inside. According to the report, Walter's father made an emergency decision. He manually rerouted power through overloaded systems, a dangerous procedure, one that bought enough time for evacuation, one that prevented mass casualties, one that ultimately cost him his life. Leah looked up. He saved them. Walter nodded. The years of uncertainty seemed visible on his face. Years of rumors, years of incomplete answers, years of wondering. The official investigation blamed equipment failure, he said. The company never wanted people asking why safety systems had been neglected. Leah understood. Acknowledging the truth would have meant admitting responsibility. It would have exposed decisions made long before lawyers and executives rewrote the narrative. So the story disappeared, except for one man who refused to let it. Walter sat down heavily on an old maintenance crate. The documents rested in his lap. For several minutes he simply stared ahead, not speaking, not moving. The grief wasn't new. It had lived with him for nearly 50 years. But grief changes when uncertainty finally leaves. The weight becomes different. Lighter in some places, heavier in others. Leah sat beside him. Neither felt the need to fill the silence. Eventually Walter smiled. A small smile, the kind that arrives after a long storm. "My mother always believed there was more to the story." Leah glanced toward the papers. "Looks like she was right." He nodded. "She died before we found it." The sadness in his voice remained, but so did something else. Peace. For the first time since Leah had met him, Walter no longer looked like a man guarding a wound. He looked like a man finally setting something down. 6 months later, the factory was gone. Demolition crews had reduced most of Riverton manufacturing to open ground. The towering smokestacks disappeared. The assembly halls vanished. The loading docks became memories. But not everything was lost. Near the entrance of a newly constructed public park stood a modest brick building. Inside, preserved behind glass, sat the original control room, the hidden room, the room Walter had protected all those years. School groups visited regularly. Local residents stopped by on weekends. Former workers brought grandchildren. Photographs lined the walls. Engineering drawings filled display cases. And one exhibit told the story that had nearly vanished forever. The story of a man who saved hundreds of lives. The story of Walter's father. On a quiet autumn afternoon, sunlight streamed through the windows. A group of students wandered through the exhibit. One boy stopped beside an electrical display. He frowned at the complicated network of switches and gauges. Then he noticed an older man standing nearby. "Excuse me," the boy asked. "Do you know how this thing worked?" Walter looked at the machine, then at the boy. A smile appeared. This time a genuine one. "I think I can explain it." The student pulled up a chair. Soon several others joined him. Walter began describing circuits, relays, transformers, and the strange personality of old electrical systems. The children listened. Questions multiplied. Laughter followed. Outside, leaves drifted across the park. Inside, knowledge passed from one generation to another. Not hidden, not forgotten, shared. And as afternoon sunlight reflected softly from polished copper switches, Walter realized something he hadn't understood for most of his life. The room had never truly been about machinery. It had been about memory, about truth, about making sure someone's sacrifice continued to matter. For nearly 50 years he had protected the past. Now, finally, he could trust the future to carry it forward. and for the first time since he was 23 years old, Walter Grayson walked away with nothing left to guard. The Things We Leave Behind. 3 months after the exhibit opened, winter returned to Riverton. The mornings arrived quietly. Thin frost covered park benches. Bare branches scratched against gray skies. The river that curved behind the old factory grounds carried sheets of mist across the water at dawn. Walter had developed a routine. Every Tuesday and Thursday, he arrived at the exhibit before opening. Not because anyone asked him to. Old habits rarely disappeared completely. They simply found new places to live. The young attendant usually unlocked the front doors a few minutes early. Walter would step inside carrying a thermos of coffee and spend an hour walking through the displays, checking things, straightening things. Sometimes he adjusted a photograph that had shifted slightly. Sometimes he wiped fingerprints from glass cases. Sometimes he simply stood in silence, listening. The building didn't hum like the factory had, but it had its own sounds. Footsteps, children talking, heating vents clicking awake, the occasional laugh echoing from the exhibit hall. Different sounds, living sounds. One snowy morning, Walter noticed something unusual. A teenage girl sat alone near the control room display. She couldn't have been older than 16. A notebook rested in her lap. She wasn't looking at her phone. She wasn't taking pictures. She was studying, actually studying. For nearly 20 minutes, she moved carefully between the exhibits, sketching electrical diagrams by hand. Walter watched from a distance. Eventually, curiosity got the better of him. He approached. The girl looked up. Oh, she seemed embarrassed. Sorry, am I in the way? Walter smiled. No, he nodded toward the notebook. What are you drawing? The girl hesitated before showing him. Inside were detailed sketches of relay systems and power routing diagrams copied from the exhibit. Walter blinked. Most visitors spent 10 minutes inside before heading for the gift shop. This girl had spent nearly 2 hours examining century-old electrical equipment. School project? He asked. She shook her head. I just like figuring out how things work. Walter studied the notebook. The drawings were accurate, very accurate. What's your name? Sophie. He nodded. You're pretty good at this. A faint smile appeared. My teachers don't think so. Why not? They say nobody uses this stuff anymore. Walter glanced around the room. He understood the feeling. Technology moved forward. Old systems became invisible. People forgot where modern things came from. Sophie looked down at her notebook. I know it's outdated. Walter considered the words. Then he slowly sat beside her. Outdated isn't the same thing as unimportant. For the next hour they talked. About electricity, about engineering, about mistakes, about problem solving. About the strange satisfaction that comes from repairing something instead of replacing it. The conversation felt natural, easy. By closing time, Sophie had filled several pages of notes. As she prepared to leave, she paused. Can I come back? Walter smiled. You don't need permission. No, she said. I mean, would you teach me some of this? The question caught him off guard. For a moment he didn't answer, because nobody had ever asked before. Not really. Then he nodded. I think that could be arranged. The weeks turned into months. Every Saturday morning, Sophie arrived at the exhibit carrying notebooks. Walter arrived carrying coffee. Together they worked through old diagrams and electrical principles. Sometimes they sat inside the preserved control room. Sometimes they walked through the park, discussing engineering problems. Sometimes they simply talked. Not every lesson involved electricity. Some involved patience. Some involved failure. Many involved stories. Walter discovered that teaching felt surprisingly different from remembering. Remembering looked backward. Teaching looked forward. One afternoon, Sophie pointed toward an old photograph of the original factory crew. Did you know all of them? Walter studied the image. Faces stared back from another century. Some young, some old. Most long gone. Most of them. Were they all electricians? He laughed softly. Not even close. Then he began pointing. Machinists, welders, pipe fitters, maintenance workers, operators, janitors, people whose names rarely appeared in newspapers, people who built things, fixed things, kept things running. Sophie listened carefully. Finally, she asked a question. Why aren't there more exhibits about people like that? Walter looked around the room. The answer wasn't simple. Because history often celebrated executives before workers, Inventors before technicians, owners before builders. Yet every machine in this room had depended on ordinary hands. Every achievement had belonged to more than one person. They get forgotten, he said quietly. Sophie frowned. That's not fair. No, it isn't. The answer lingered between them. Spring arrived slowly. The river thawed. Trees regained their leaves. The exhibit became one of Riverton's most visited local attractions. One morning, Leah Moreno returned. She had not visited for several months. New projects had taken her across the state. When she entered the building, she found Walter standing beside a display case explaining transformer safety to a small group of students. He looked different. Not younger, not stronger, lighter. The burden she had first encountered inside that dying factory seemed gone. After the students left, Leah approached. Walter smiled immediately. Good to see you. You too. She glanced around the room. Looks like you've become part of the exhibit. Walter laughed. Apparently. Leah noticed Sophie organizing educational materials nearby. The teenager waved. Walter introduced them. As they talked, Leah quietly observed the scene. The old electrician, the student, the visitors, the preserved machinery, the stories being shared. Then she understood something. The factory had closed, but its purpose hadn't disappeared. It had simply changed. The building once produced motors. Now it produced memory, knowledge, connection, a different kind of work. Maybe an equally important one. Later that afternoon, sunlight streamed through the large front windows. Visitors drifted between exhibits. Children asked questions. Parents listened. And near the center of the room, Walter stood beside the control panel he had once protected from demolition. For years he had feared losing it, feared losing the truth, feared losing the people attached to it. He finally understood something his father might have understood long ago. Legacy wasn't preserved by locking it away. Legacy survived when it was shared. And as voices filled the room that had once been silent, Walter Grayson realized that some circuits never truly power down. They simply find new paths, new hands, new generations. And somewhere beneath the steady hum of conversation, the story continued.